James Carter walked into the airport, rolling his small suitcase behind him. He was finally heading home after months of being away on duty. The exhaustion from long flights and busy schedules weighed on him, but the thought of resting in first class made him feel a little better. He had earned this comfort. After years of service in the Navy, he was used to discipline, patience, and respect. He didn't need special treatment, just fairness like everyone else. The airport was buzzing with travelers. Families rushed through security. Business people talked on phones, and children clung to their parents. James moved through the crowd calmly, used to being in chaotic environments. He checked his boarding pass again. First class, seat 3A. It was a well-deserved luxury after spending so much time away from home. As he reached the boarding gate, he noticed a woman standing nearby, glancing at him repeatedly. She was dressed in expensive clothes, holding a designer handbag, and had James walk down the jet bridge, keeping his posture straight and composed. He had spent years in the Navy, trained to remain calm in all situations. A small incident like this wasn't worth his energy. Still, he couldn't ignore the uncomfortable feeling settling in his chest. He had paid for his ticket like everyone else. Why was it so hard for some people to accept that? As he stepped onto the plane, a flight attendant greeted him with a polite smile. "Welcome aboard, sir. Your seat is just ahead." James nodded in thanks and moved toward his seat -3A, a comfortable window spot in first class. He placed his carry-on in the overhead compartment and settled into his seat. The soft cushion felt like a relief after all the hours he had spent standing and traveling. A few moments later, he heard the familiar sound of heels clicking against the floor. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The same woman from earlier was making her way down the aisle. As expected, she had a first-class ticket too. She stopped right next to him, glancing at the seat numbers as if hoping for a mistake. When she realized James was indeed sitting in first class, she sighed and sat down in the seat across from him. She adjusted her handbag, making a show of her expensive jewelry and designer watch. Then, as if unable to help herself, she spoke. "This is surprising," she said, glancing at James. James turned his head slightly, raising an eyebrow. "What is?" She gave a small shrug. "Oh, nothing. Just didn't expect to see you here." James knew exactly what she meant, but he refused to let her get a reaction out of him. He simply nodded and looked out the window. The runway stretched far into the distance, the sky painted in soft shades of orange as the sun began to set. The flight attendants continued preparing for takeoff. One of them walked through the aisle, offering drinks to the first-class passengers. When she reached James, she smiled warmly. "Would you like anything to drink, sir?" "Just water, please," James said. The woman across from him ordered a glass of champagne, then smirked slightly. "Might as well enjoy the perks of first class." "Right," she said, her voice carrying a hint of sarcasm. James remained silent, sipping his water. He had no interest in arguing or proving himself to her. People like her often spoke without thinking. He wasn't here to teach her a lesson. He just wanted to enjoy his flight. As the plane prepared for takeoff, a sudden voice came over the intercom. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking." James paused mid-sip, recognizing the voice immediately. A small smile formed on his lips. He hadn't expected this flight to be anything special, but fate had a way of making things interesting. The plane's engines hummed softly as it prepared for takeoff. James leaned back in his seat, letting out a slow breath. He was looking forward to a quiet, comfortable flight. The woman across from him, however, didn't seem ready to let things go. She adjusted her seatbelt, then glanced at him again. "So, what do you do?" she asked, her tone casual but with an edge of curiosity. James turned his head slightly. He had heard that question many times, and the way people asked it often revealed their assumptions. Some were genuinely curious. Others, like this woman, seemed to be searching for a reason to justify their earlier behavior. "I work in the Navy," James said simply. The woman raised an eyebrow. Oh, that's interesting. She tilted her head, as if trying to figure out more. How long have you been in? James gave a small smile. A long time. She nodded slowly, sipping her champagne. Well, that's nice. Hard work is important. I suppose the military teaches discipline, doesn't it? James didn't reply. He had seen this before, people making small talk to feel better about their assumptions. It didn't bother him anymore. He had learned long ago that true confidence didn't come from proving himself to strangers. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin, checking seatbelts and preparing for takeoff, the pilot's voice returned over the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to depart. We're expecting a smooth flight today, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey. James smiled slightly. He knew that voice. It had been years, but he never forgot people he worked with, especially those he mentored. The woman across from him didn't notice his reaction. She had already pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages as the plane began to move. The flight attendants reminded passengers to switch their devices to airplane mode, and soon the plane was rolling down the runway. As the aircraft lifted off the ground, James closed his eyes for a moment, enjoying the calm. He had flown thousands of times, but there was always something peaceful about watching the world shrink below him. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, the flight attendants began serving drinks and meals. James accepted a simple meal and quietly ate while the woman across from him continued to glance his way now and then, as if still trying to figure him out. Then, about 30 minutes into the flight, something unexpected happened. The curtain separating the cockpit from first class moved aside, and the pilot himself stepped out. He was scanning the passengers, looking for someone. When his eyes landed on James, his face lit up. With a wide smile, he walked over and spoke in a voice loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. Well, I didn't expect to see you here, Admiral Carter." James looked up from his meal, a small smile forming on his lips. The pilot stood before him, grinning like an old friend who had just run into someone after years apart. "Admiral Carter," the pilot repeated, shaking his head in pleasant surprise. "It's been a long time, sir." James nodded, setting his fork down. "It has. Good to see you, Captain Reynolds." The passengers around them fell silent. Some had already been watching, but now, even those who weren't paying attention turned their heads. The word Admiral hung in the air, making a few people sit up straighter. The woman sitting across from James, who had spent the entire time questioning him, suddenly froze. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her champagne glass as she stared at him. The pilot, still smiling, reached out and shook James's hand firmly. "Sir, I owe a lot of my career to you. I still remember the advice you gave me when I was just starting out. It helped shape the officer I became." James gave a small chuckle. "I just pointed you in the right direction. You did the hard work yourself." Captain Reynolds laughed. "Maybe so, but I'll always be grateful." He glanced around at the other passengers and then back at James. "What brings you on this flight?" "Just heading home," James said. "It's been a long trip." "Well, I'm honored to have you aboard, Admiral," Reynolds said with genuine respect. "If there's anything you need during this flight, don't hesitate to ask." James nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Captain." As the pilot returned to the cockpit, the silence in first class lingered for a few more moments. The other passengers exchanged glances, clearly impressed. Some even looked slightly embarrassed for assuming James was just an ordinary traveler. But no one looked more uncomfortable than the woman across from him. Her posture had changed completely. Gone was the confident, dismissive attitude she had earlier. Instead, she sat stiffly, staring at James as if seeing him for the first time. She cleared her throat and shifted in her seat. I didn't realize," she said awkwardly. "You're an admiral." James turned his gaze toward her, his expression calm. "That's right." She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if struggling to find the right words. Finally, she forced a small, nervous laugh. "Well, that's impressive." James didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The moment had spoken for itself. The flight continued, but the energy in the cabin had shifted. James could feel the weight of the lesson settling in, not just for the woman, but for everyone who had witnessed the interaction. Respect wasn't about appearances. It wasn't about assumptions. And sometimes, the best response to judgment wasn't anger. It was letting the truth speak for itself. The cabin slowly returned to normal, but the mood had changed. James could still feel the weight of the moment lingering in the air. The pilot's visit had left a lasting impression. And now, every time a flight attendant passed by, they offered him extra attention with polite smiles and respectful nods. James, however, remained the same. He didn't act any differently, didn't demand any special treatment. He simply leaned back in his seat and sipped his water, waiting for the flight to continue as usual. Across from him, the woman who had doubted him earlier was noticeably quieter. She had barely touched her champagne since the pilot left. It was clear she was still processing what had happened. She stole quick glances at James, her earlier confidence replaced by hesitation. After a few minutes, she cleared her throat softly. I didn't know," she said, her voice quieter than before. James looked at her, his face calm and unreadable. "Didn't know what?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "That you were important." James raised an eyebrow, but remained silent, letting her continue. She gave a small, nervous smile. "I guess I made some wrong assumptions earlier." James nodded slightly. He wasn't surprised by her words. He had seen this many times before, people realizing too late that their first impressions had been completely wrong. "I see," James said simply. The woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I didn't mean to be rude," she added quickly. I don't know. I thought." She stopped, realizing there was no good way to finish that sentence. James let out a quiet sigh, finally deciding to speak. "You thought I didn't belong in first class." Her face turned slightly red. She opened her mouth to deny it, but then stopped. There was no point in lying. He had seen through her from the beginning. Instead of making excuses, she nodded slowly. "Yes," she admitted, "and I was wrong." James studied her for a moment before giving a small, understanding nod. "People make mistakes," he said. "It's what they do after that matters." She seemed surprised by his response, as if expecting him to be angry. Instead, he remained calm, his voice even and steady. She bit her lip, then took a deep breath. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice sincere this time, "for how I acted earlier." James looked at her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Apology accepted. The tension between them seemed to ease, though the lesson remained clear. The woman, once so sure of her assumptions, had been forced to reconsider everything in just a short amount of time. For the rest of the flight, she remained polite and respectful. She didn't try to force conversation, nor did she try to justify her actions. Instead, she simply sat quietly, seemingly lost in thought. James, as always, remained composed. He had learned long ago that respect couldn't be demanded, it had to be earned. And sometimes, the best way to teach a lesson wasn't with anger, but with dignity. The flight continued smoothly, the steady hum of the engines filling the cabin. James sat comfortably in his seat, gazing out the window at the endless sky. He had always loved flying, not just as a passenger, but throughout his years in the Navy. The feeling of being above the world, seeing things from a greater perspective, had always given him a sense of peace. He glanced around the first-class section. The other passengers had returned to their own routines, some watching movies, others reading or dozing off. The woman across from him, however, remained thoughtful. She hadn't gone back to her usual confident attitude. Instead, she sat quietly, occasionally sneaking glances at James as if trying to understand him better. After some time, a flight attendant approached James with a warm smile. "Admiral Carter, the captain wanted to send his regards again and asked if you'd like anything special during the flight." James gave a polite nod. I appreciate it, but I'm fine. Thank you. The attendant nodded and moved on, but once again, the woman across from him had heard everything. She took a slow breath, then finally spoke again. You must have seen a lot, she said, her voice softer than before. James turned his head slightly. I have. She hesitated, then leaned forward slightly, as if gathering courage. Can I ask you something? James gave a small nod. Go ahead. She bit her lip, choosing her words carefully. What's the most important thing you've learned in your career? James studied her for a moment. It wasn't the kind of question he had expected from her, but he could see that she was genuinely curious now, not just about his rank or status, but about the experiences that had shaped him. He thought for a moment before answering. Respect, he said simply. She tilted her head, waiting for him to explain. James took a slow breath. Respect isn't just about titles or uniforms. It's about how you treat people, no matter who they are or where they come from. I've worked with people from all over the world, different backgrounds, different beliefs. The one thing that always mattered was respect. The woman nodded slowly, processing his words. I never really thought about it that way, she admitted. James gave a small smile. Most people don't, until they have to. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. I guess I have a lot to learn. James didn't reply right away. Instead, he gave her a steady look. We all do, he said. The woman smiled slightly, nodding in understanding. It was clear she had changed, maybe not completely, but enough to start seeing the world differently. The rest of the flight remained peaceful, but the moment between them left an impact. Sometimes, the biggest lessons in life came when people least expected them. As the flight continued, James leaned back in his seat, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. He hadn't planned on teaching anyone a lesson today, but life had its way of setting things right without force. The woman across from him, who had once looked at him with doubt, now sat in deep thought. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight attendants moved around, offering blankets and checking on passengers. The soft murmur of conversations and the occasional clinking of glasses filled the air, creating a peaceful atmosphere. After a while, the woman spoke again. Admiral Carter, she said hesitantly. James turned his head toward her, his expression calm. Yes. She took a deep breath, as if gathering her thoughts. I was wrong about you, she admitted. And not just about you, about the way I judge people too quickly. James studied her for a moment before nodding. It takes a lot to admit that. She sighed, playing with the edge of her napkin. I guess I never really thought about how much I assume about people. Today made me realize that I might have been doing it all my life without even knowing. James gave her a thoughtful look. It's easy to judge when you only look at the surface, he said. But people are more than what they seem at first glance. She nodded slowly. I see that now. For a moment, there was silence between them. Then she smiled slightly, a bit of her old confidence returning. But this time, it wasn't the kind that came from superiority. It was the kind that came from understanding. So, she said, tilting her head, what's next for you, Admiral? Any big plans after this flight? James chuckled lightly. Just heading home for some well-earned rest. She laughed softly. I guess even admirals need a break. James nodded. That they do. The flight continued smoothly, and soon the announcement came that they would be preparing for landing. Passengers adjusted their seats, put away their belongings, and prepared for the descent. The woman turned to James one last time before they landed. Thank you, she said. James raised an eyebrow. For what? For your patience, she said honestly, and for not putting me in my place the way you could have. You let me learn on my own. James smiled slightly. Some lessons are best learned that way. As the plane touched down, she gave him one last respectful nod before turning forward in her seat. James had no doubt that she would leave this flight as a different person than the one who had boarded. And sometimes, That was the best outcome of all. The plane touched down smoothly on the runway, the soft rumble of the wheels signaling the end of the journey. Passengers began shifting in their seats, stretching their legs, and preparing to disembark. James remained seated, watching the world outside the window as the airport lights glowed in the early evening sky. The woman across from him took a deep breath, as if steadying herself. She looked at James one last time, this time with a genuine expression of respect. "Well, Admiral Carter, it was an interesting flight." James gave a small nod. That it was. She hesitated, then extended her hand. "I hope you enjoy your time at home." James looked at her hand for a moment, then shook it firmly. "Safe travels." As the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers stood up, gathering their bags. James remained seated for a while, letting the crowd move ahead. The woman gave him one last nod before stepping into the aisle and disappearing with the others. A few minutes later, a flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Admiral, the captain asked if you'd like to exit first. He'd be honored." James smiled slightly. "That's kind of him, but I'll leave with everyone else." The flight attendant nodded, clearly expecting that answer. James had never been the type to demand special treatment, and today was no different. As he walked off the plane, he spotted Captain Reynolds near the cockpit door. The pilot gave him a firm handshake. "It was an honor having you on board, sir." James nodded. "Good flight, Captain. You're doing well." Reynolds grinned. "Thanks to leaders like you." With that, James stepped into the jet bridge, feeling the cool airport air. He made his way through the terminal, passing passengers who had no idea who he was or what had happened on that flight. That was fine with him. He didn't need recognition. He had lived a life of service, not for praise, but because it was the right thing to do. As he walked toward the exit, he spotted the woman from the flight standing by the baggage claim. She was staring at her phone, but looked up just as he passed. Their eyes met briefly, and this time, there was no hesitation in her gaze, only understanding. She gave him a small, respectful nod. James returned it, then continued walking. Sometimes, the most meaningful lessons didn't come from arguments or lectures. They came from moments, small, unexpected moments that changed how a person saw the world. James had no doubt that the woman had left that flight a little different than when she boarded. And perhaps because of that, she would go forward in life treating others with a little more respect. That, to James, was more than enough.